So my name is Matt Edelman, and I've been working at PayPal for the last 10 years. And I started at PayPal as a web developer, and just from pure interest, started messing around with Selenium because I liked watching browsers do stuff without me doing anything, and that was just fascinating to me. And prior to joining PayPal, I worked at a company where I automated Excel with something called, gosh, I'm not going to remember the name of it. It's kind of an early automation tool. It was the sort of thing you paid for. It's not coming to me. But Selenium was sort of an amazing thing, just like the internet was when I first saw it, because it was open source and it was something you could just download and use and automate with. So I was just always interested in automation. And about 5 years ago, PayPal started using Node.js. And we didn't have any test framework to use with Node.js. And there was a Selenium WebDriver binding. So I decided to try and write a framework around it. And because Node.js was new at PayPal and nobody really knew how to test there, this thing that I wrote just became the thing that everybody used to test at PayPal. You could say it was kind of a captive audience syndrome, but it was also because I was there on an open source team to train all the myriad teams that we had how to use this thing. But it sort of just, Nemo, which is what it was called and still called, just sort of grew up because of A, this captive audience, and B, because I was there to really bring everybody up to speed on how to use it. So there's this little pool of, not little, it's a pool of almost 1,000 developers that use this tool that almost nobody's ever heard of, except at PayPal. Meanwhile, in the world at large, there's been this tool called Nightwatch, which is a Node.js-based testing framework that uses JSON wire protocol that most people would use. If they're starting a Node.js project, they would say, I'll use a Nightwatch because I've heard of it, I'm going to pull it in, I'm going to use it. Most Node.js-based testers are familiar with it. So over the past 2 or 3 years, I started to hear more people saying, hey, why can't we use Nightwatch at PayPal? And my answer has been, A, you can, and B, I don't really, my job is not to do test frameworks. That's something I did a few years ago, so if you want to use Nightwatch, go ahead. So what I wanted to do was compare the two frameworks just to see what the differences were, because I actually hadn't done it before, and really see if I could help PayPal make a decision about what they're going to do going forward with Node.js and automation testing. So I can't say that I'm a totally neutral party, but I tried to be as neutral as I could to see, what are the benefits of one versus the other, and that's sort of where this started. And before I move on, I just wanted to say thank you to Bill McGee for allowing me to give this presentation here, and Sauce Labs for hosting, and all the people who work on Selenium and make it the great open source project that it is. And thank you for you folks who've shown up tonight. So just as an introduction, Nemo uses Selenium WebDriver, which is the Node.js NPM module with the Selenium WebDriver bindings. If you're going to use Nemo, you're going to basically write Nemo Mocha tests, and you've got the WebDriver API available in those tests on the this context, and you've got a view abstraction which adds some sugar on top of the Selenium WebDriver API. And the thing that makes Nemo super useful, at PayPal at least, is the fact that it's got this JSON configuration abstraction that's called Confi, which is something that was built for our Express web framework as well. And I used it in Nemo because I found it really fun to use and just super useful, which we'll look at it a little bit later. And it's quote unquote popular at PayPal. And if you look on open source, it has 250 GitHub stars. So, so let's, quick introduction to Nightwatch, which again is the other framework at PayPal that anybody ever talks about. So at PayPal, you'd think those are the only two frameworks there were. So first of all, it implements its own wire protocol command. It does not use Selenium WebDriver as a dependency. You can write in its own built-in test format or in the Mocha exports style, but they're basically similar. And the API of Nightwatch is available as an argument to the test methods. So again, that's very similar. And the configuration looks a lot the same. It doesn't have the config stuff that we can talk about later, but it's just basically a JSON or a JavaScript file that allows you to have various environmentally based run configurations. And if you look at the GitHub repository, it has about 8,000 GitHub stars. So comparing that to Nemo, obviously in the open source community, there's a lot of popularity there. There's a lot of eyes on it. It's used a lot, or historically has been. So to do a comparison, I said, okay, well, we'll have to have some baseline. What are we going to do with both frameworks? And for me, this was, even though I've been engineering a long time, I've never actually done a head-to-head comparison of two things, which is odd. I feel embarrassed to say that. But I said, okay, I'll do that with these two things. So what am I going to do with them? I'm going to write positive and negative and experimentation use case-based tests. I want to data drive those tests and be able to run them in different environments. And I want to be able to hit breakpoints and debug on those breakpoints. And I want to see how do I abstract the sort of basis of the test, which is the locators, the test locators, into objects of some sort. Like, what does that look like in these two frameworks? So before we move on, let me open up our little test application that we're going to use. And just show you really quickly what it is. So this is Pay Friend, and it's basically a login authentication-based application, and it's got some latency built into it. So when you click on a button, it waits a few seconds before it does anything. But you can log in, and you can add a credit card, you can add a bank account, and you can log out. And that's all that it is. And the only other interesting thing about it is that it has an experimentation aspect to it. So if I keep refreshing the page, eventually I'll see a credit card form that's a little bit different. And in true demo style, it's not going to show it. So math.random is not so .random. But essentially, what there is that every 50% of the time you should see a credit card type drop down here. So let me try just a couple more times. This is ridiculous. Really? There it is. Thank you so much. So every 10th time, math.random, everybody. So that's the application essentially. And the other thing about it is that if you add a thing with 1001001, whether that's a credit card or a bank account, you get a negative response. So there's this way to create a negative test case. So that's the test application that we're going to use. I just wanted to show that really briefly, and then we can get back to the slides here. So when you're comparing two things, you want to kind of say, okay, what am I trying to see in these two things? So what's the documentation support and community look like? How easy it is to install? What does the configuration look like? How is the configurability? There's a little bit of a difference there, so I put those two a little separately. How can you debug? What's the abstraction? And did we achieve the goals that we wanted to? So I'm just going to go through these one point at a time, and I'll be flipping from my slides to WebStorm to the application, and I'll try and be as little choppy as I can. Nightwatch is highly active in the open source community. There's a lot of activity on Stack Overflow. If you search Nightwatch and any term, you get a lot of results, which is great. So I've learned Nightwatch over the past 2 days, and it was real easy because I found a lot of results, which is great. And there's the documentation is really good. It's what you want from an open source product. You want to be able to know everything without having to have someone come and teach it to you. The documentation is there. Nemo, essentially outside of PayPal, is invisible. There's really, the documentation is scattered over several repositories, which really, when I started doing open source work with Node.js, I thought that was the right pattern, which was essentially don't build anything that's bigger than it needs to be, and if you need to scatter documentation over several readmes, so be it. But in reality, if you want people to use a product, you need to build a product, and maybe it needs to kind of bring several modules together seamlessly, which is something that it has not done. But within PayPal, because there is a community of people who use it, it's heavily used there because there's a Slack channel with a lot of questions and answers. There's me, the author of Nemo, who's there to help people through it. So it's heavily used there, but again, that's within PayPal. Outside of PayPal, it's virtually invisible. So in terms of documentation, community, and support, Nightwatch is clearly the winner, hands down. In terms of ease of installation, with Nemo, you just have to do an npm install of the CLI, and then you can call the CLI, and then immediately you've got a test framework in your application. And then you have to download Chrome driver, and that's it. So you're basically ready to automate at that point, which I won't bother demoing that. With Nightwatch, the one thing I wanted to mention, and I think it's really just because it's not based off of Selenium WebDriver, the extra step is that you have to download the standalone server, the Selenium standalone server, and you have to have that additional process started on your machine to do any automation. So I seem to remember that as kind of an earlier feature of Selenium WebDriver, but now that there is all the Chrome driver, Gecko driver, so forth, binaries, you don't have to do that anymore if you're using Selenium WebDriver. So this was an extra step with Nightwatch that made me say, okay, well, this is something in that framework that they're suffering from because they don't rely upon Selenium WebDriver. So in terms of installing and getting started, Nemo's a winner. You don't really have to read much documentation. It's really quick to do it, and you're automating very quickly. In terms of configuration, so let me just pop back to my, here's my Nemo versus Nightwatch repository, and I've got Nemo in one folder and Nightwatch in the other. And their configurations look very similar. So if I look at the Nightwatch configuration, it's, hopefully if that's not quite big enough, let me do this. Can I do that? That works on my screen, but it doesn't work for you guys.
It's okay, thank you.
Okay, cool. But essentially, you've got some stuff about where are my tests, where are my reports going to go, what are my global variables, and then you've got these things called test settings where you have different run configurations for different environments. So you can split those off and say I want my run configurations to be browser-based, or maybe I want to split them off by this folder of tests versus this folder of tests versus this one. So it's basically like your main grouping of tests. And Nightwatch and Nemo look essentially the same in that regard. So in Nemo, I've got it based off of browsers, Chrome, Firefox, and then there's one other. But the configuration is about the same. It's kind of a push. So that's kind of how I called it out. I like them both. What I would say about Nemo that's a little bit interesting is that it uses this confi configuration engine, which allows you to write comments into your JSON. So usually you can't do that in JSON because Node.js is going to say, I don't like that. I'm going to throw an exception. And you've also got these things called short stop handlers, which is a pseudo protocol within confi itself where you can say, something colon, and then it actually resolves to something else. So this path will actually resolve to the working directory. And then there's some other protocols that you can use like require or exec, et cetera. So it makes JSON a little more interesting. So that's something, if you learn about those protocols, it makes the configuration a little bit more powerful. But in general, I'd say it's a push. So in terms of configurability versus configuration, the thing that I would say is sort of the thing that pushes over to the Nemo side is really the fact that it's relying upon Selenium WebDriver. So that's not Nemo or anything I did. It's just the fact that it uses Selenium WebDriver. And if you go to the Selenium WebDriver documentation, you can see all these capabilities, APIs, and objects that you can use to configure Chrome or any other browser for all the environments that you're interested in, whether it's mobile or headless Chrome or whatever it might be. It's just, to me, it's a lot easier to start up the WebDriver using those APIs versus just command line arguments, which is what you're able to do in Nightwatch. And then the other thing about Selenium WebDriver is it's got this async and await syntax, which is a lot easier to write, reason with, and debug. For me, at least, I guess that could be a matter of opinion as well. Some of it's not really opinion-based, like debugging, which we'll talk about later. But here's a suite, a basic suite in Nemo, and you can see that it's all async and await syntax, so it's discrete commands that you can actually step through with a debugger, which I find to be a lot better, at least in terms of debugging versus what you'd see in something like Nightwatch, where you start with the browser object and then all the other methods are just chained off of it. If you try and debug this, it's very difficult to do that. So for that reason, I gave the win to, quote unquote Nemo, but really to Selenium WebDriver. So in terms of debugging, here's what it would look like if you wanted to hit a breakpoint with something like Nightwatch, where you have a chained syntax. If you really wanted to hit a breakpoint after this click event and before the wait for element visible event or command, you would have to, put a callback function in, and then you could set a breakpoint in that callback function, and that's the way you could actually break there and inspect anything that you wanted to inspect. And in terms of actually doing that in Nightwatch, I couldn't find any instructions on how to actually run it in breakpoint debugging mode. So it wasn't very straightforward. Versus Nemo, which again with async and await is pretty simple. All you have to do is use the inspect break CLI flag of Node.js, and you're able to hit breakpoints. So let me just do that really quick. We haven't seen any automation yet, and that's boring, so let's do that. So I have a shortcut to this. Let me make this bigger. So since Node 7, you can just add these flags to the command line and pretty easily get into the Chrome DevTools. So we're automating, and we hit our debugger breakpoint on the first line where I set the debugger keyword, and we can just step through it and watch as the browser is kind of automating through that process. I always hit the wrong button. That's the one I wanted. So you can actually inspect all the elements which you would want to do in a sort of debugging situation. I'll just close that out. Okay. So because of that, I give debugging the win to Nemo, but again, really to Selenium WebDriver, because that's the basis of what we're doing here. So the next one was locator or page object abstractions. And in Nemo, we have something called the Nemo view, which is an abstraction on top of the WebDriver API that's accessible on this Nemo.view namespace. And that's essentially it. So what it looks like from the code side of things. Sorry. There we go. So I have this set of locator files, and it's just JSON, and each one of these JSON files just has a set of CSS locators in it. And that's really all that Nemo is going to provide you is this directory. And if you have this directory, then you get something like this, where you have nemo.view.card, for example, and you've got these various elements that you specified, like the form or the credit card number, and then you have these convenience methods from it. So this is the first kind of level of abstraction. With Nightwatch, you've got a more sophisticated page object, which is not only the JSON locators, but also some combined functionality with those. So when you have those JSON locators and functionality, for example, you can have a bank page object, and within that bank object, you can have whatever methods you define. So for example, I was able to take all the commands and put them into that object locator and get this to object and the to method and the add method, and vastly simplify the test syntax. So if we look at that page object, this guy right here. So up top, we've got the locators, which are the same. They're just these CSS locators. And it's really nice when you write your own test app. You can just put IDs on everything, and then you can automate it really easily. We were talking about testability earlier, and when you just do this for fun, you can make a nice testable app. But I've seen React apps that I don't know how people test them. It's pretty insane. But in any case, there's this command section in the Nightwatch page objects that allows you to abstract your WebDriver commands to these places. And you can see that there's this sort of templating syntax that replaces this at whatever with the actual locator, and that's pretty nice. I like their page object abstraction. And when I originally wrote Nemo, we made a plugin functionality for it to say, hey, if you want to write your own abstraction, write it as a plugin, and then you can feed it back into the ecosystem. And somebody at PayPal actually did write a page object abstraction, but they don't work at PayPal anymore. They don't maintain it, so we don't currently have one. But it's there, and that's one of the other things I learned about open source, which is just because you create an ecosystem doesn't mean people are going to flock to it and do anything about it. But that's certainly something that still could be done, is to sort of make a better page abstraction. But at this point, Nightwatch is the winner out of the box. It has this really nice page object abstraction. But I was able to kind of do something similar with Nemo quickly, which I think most people who write code are used to doing, which is to refactor and pull stuff up and that sort of thing. So this was the smallest I could make my little suite of tests, was to look like this. So this is running through the positive and negative test cases for adding a credit card with just a very few lines of code. So what that looks like is I have these flow modules that each have these methods like login, logout, or to and add. So if we look at those really quick. They take advantage of the fact that we have an object or a locator abstraction, and they just put them into these other external modules. So it's really not that much different than a page object. And my original thought around page objects or not page objects was that web applications don't really deal in pages anymore. It's usually a single page application, so it's not a page and then another page and then another page. It's really an application with a bunch of views in them, and the views are all alive at the same time. So I didn't really see a lot of value in a quote-unquote page object itself. And I still hew to that, and I don't know if that's just me being old-fashioned, but or new-fashioned, I don't know what it is. But I still am not sure that a page object is required to do automation well. So if you look at, for example, so starting from the inline set of tests, which doesn't have any abstraction at all. And these locators are nice, but if they weren't nice, then you can see how this would be kind of ugly with these big long strings, these big long locator strings if they were there. And then going to using the view object abstraction. Maybe this is enough abstraction, I don't know. What I've seen a lot of people do is they get so abstract that I can't unwind what they've done. So if I sit and try and debug somebody's test with them, I have no idea what they've done. It takes forever for them to just try and explain to me where they've packed everything away. So to me, this might be the right level of abstraction, but then when you get into this level, that's really nice. That's so short, but still there's some abstraction to it. In any case, the long and short of it is there at least is a page object in Nightwatch. So in terms of automation goals, with Nightwatch, I couldn't do a data-driven testing scenario, which I was surprised about, because at PayPal, in the years that I've been doing Nemo and working with automation, that's a question I frequently get. How do I data drive tests? If I have all these scenarios, how do I make, how do I basically do that? And the other thing that surprised me was that you couldn't easily branch a test for something simple like, hey, this field is here sometimes, and then sometimes it's not. That was surprisingly difficult. With Nemo, I was able to do that partially because of some features that I wrote, and mostly, at least in terms of the branching, because of async and await and the fact that you could get a result from a WebDriver command before moving to the next command. So to illustrate that, if we look at the sort of the inline test here, if we go to the credit card part, there's just this one part that says, sometimes this drop down is present and sometimes it's not. So in Nemo and Selenium WebDriver, all you have to do is say, is this element present or not? If it is, then we'll click on it. If not, we'll move on. In Nightwatch, it was not straightforward. I had to actually search a Stack Overflow thread and look around, and it was a bit abstract. But obviously, if you're testing for a living, you would take that abstraction, put it in a file somewhere, and then you'd have it for the rest of your life. But it wasn't there out of the box. So in terms of the goals that I had set out to achieve, Nemo wins, but then again, I'm not really a partial observer in all of this, or impartial observer, so maybe my goals were skewed by the fact that I knew what Nemo could do. So the summary of all this is sort of, here's where Nemo versus Nightwatch, where Nemo won versus Nightwatch. And maybe it looks great, like, oh, Nemo won all these things, but the bottom line is, without documentation or a community, a project's not going anywhere. And that's really the thing I'm taking away from this exercise, is that I may think that the framework that I wrote and the framework that's in use at PayPal is great, and it works really well, but unless there's a community around it, and unless there's documentation and somebody outside of a single point of failure to move it forward, it's really not going to succeed. So this is the story that I'm going to take back to PayPal and say, look, we as a company need to decide what we're doing here. Like, are we using Nemo? Are we using Nightwatch? Do we need to use one of the other competitors? I would say what I take away from this is that something needs to be based on Selenium WebDriver in Node.js for it to be truly effective, whether that's Nemo or something else. And I heard about a couple tonight, like WebDriver IO and Test Cafe, that I think I need to look into and see if I can bring that back to PayPal and say, look, we need to get behind one of these, because right now the ecosystem is sort of a mess. People within PayPal don't really know what's going on in the world, because they've got, either people are using Nemo or they're using Nightwatch, and there's a whole world out there. One of the other things about open source is how much people don't really look into it. There's like a subset of developers at any given company that do, and then a lot of other people just sort of go with the flow. So yeah, on the one hand, I pat myself on the back. Nemo wins this competition that I rigged for it. But on the other hand, it's not going anywhere without a community. And that was, I think that's the end of the slides, really. Let me see if I had. See, did my mic go dead? There we go. So one thing I wanted to show was just some parallel runs, because who doesn't like parallel automation, right? So let me just really quickly show off the stuff that I wrote around being parallel. So with the config configuration, I've got this set of profiles. and they all are based on this data in the config folder under scenarios. So this is that thing I mentioned earlier about a shortstop handler. So this actually, when the configuration gets consumed, it's going to go find this module and resolve it and spit out the actual stuff that's there. And that stuff looks like this. So it's basically just your positive and negative scenarios. So you've got your good credit card number and bank number, and then the what the result message, the good message looks like versus the bad message in CSS. And then we've also got two profiles for Chrome and Firefox. So if I run the parallel configuration that I've got, it's going to load, or it's going to launch both Firefox and Chrome. And I think it'll fail because I haven't started, no, I did start the application, so it's going to succeed. So we got 8 tests to run in parallel, two each actually. So there's 4 parallel runs with 2 tests of each. And there's a set of tags associated with them. So you can see there's the Chrome profile and the Firefox profile, and there's the key, the data key of the good or positive test scenarios, and then bad or negative test scenarios. So all that parallelism comes out of the box with Nemo, which I'm pretty proud of. But again, I need to look into some of the other frameworks that I've heard about tonight and see if maybe they would fit the bill as well. And then let me run one other thing and show off something that's just in the community. Again, with open source, you can kind of suck other stuff in and use it as long as the licenses allow for that. So if I just run the regular Nemo configuration, this is the inline set of tests that I showed earlier. So it's running through the 2 positive and the 2 negative scenarios. And the other thing I wanted to highlight is that we're getting a screen capture after each test runs. So this was just a series of tests. It wasn't in parallel. It was just 4 tests in series. And we see the report file here. And the directory structure is date stamped and time-stamped, so that as I'm running tests throughout the day and over time, I get a really nice, basically I can drill down and say, okay, what's the latest test I ran, or what's the last test I ran yesterday, sort of a thing. So I've been running a lot of tests today, and this is the last one I ran, and the directories are named based on the keys that you see in the output table here. And we've got sort of the automatically named screenshots. So I'm pretty happy with this. Honestly, I don't know if this is something that PayPal needs to carry forward, because we need to look at all open source projects before we get too carried away and in love with the stuff that we may be doing at our own desks. But again, that was why I wanted to take this opportunity to come out and do this, because I have been at PayPal for 10 years. And I have been, in my own little world. So I wanted to kind of push myself out and say, okay, how do we get to the next step? Like, we have to evaluate all the possible options that there are. But that's essentially it. And I would show you more about Nightwatch, except again, I'm kind of a newbie at it. But I can say that I learned very quickly because the documentation is really complete. So props to the folks that do work on that project. And I've seen, for example, that Nightwatch has something that they say is coming out soon, if we go to their website, called Night Owl. And I've been waiting. I've signed up to the email list to find out what Night Owl is, but I haven't seen anything yet. But it's apparently something where you can run from the cloud. So maybe it sounds like serverless testing sort of a thing. I don't know what it is exactly. And there's some features in Nemo that are maybe along the same lines, but I'm not going to go down that path right now. But that's the presentation. I'll stop talking and see if there's any questions or anything like that.
I was actually wondering, how are you running the Mocha test in parallel? Is there a parallel runner for Mocha that you
Yeah, so I'm using, let's see, I think the module is called Threads or something like that. I have to look, but it's just an open source module that runs node processes in parallel, like a thread each. And then I'm using the programmatic Mocha API.
Okay. So this is a runner that you wrote on top of Threads.
On top of which?
On this threading package that you.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I could. Yeah.
You wrote a custom like parser for Mocha, or is it just running each file in an individual process? Like, I'm just kind of curious.
Let me pull it up. It's not too hard to find. So let's see where that guy is. So the runner is here, and this is where we're requiring Mocha. And let me find the.
So you did write a custom runner.
Well, it's you could say, I guess so. Yeah, I mean, Mocha has a programmatic interface, and I wrote basically using that. And then I'm using this. Where is that thing? Threads. That's the module. So it's the one I found, and it worked, and it didn't break, so I kept using it. Yeah.
Have you tried testing network traffic, analyzing network traffic through proxy?
What is it?
Have you tried testing network traffic, stuff that's going out and in from the network? Like, like using proxy, even Charles or rolling out proxy?
Personally, no. I know that folks are using proxies at PayPal for various things.
So Nemo does not handle that, right?
I mean, you can use a proxy. You can pass it in with the WebDriver capabilities. So basically, anything you can configure in Selenium.
Selenium you can do.
Yeah, for sure.
Probably run the Nightwatch.
Maybe. Yeah. Again, it's.
I'm not familiar with the Nightwatch.
Yeah, it's an easy answer with Nemo. Whatever you can do with Selenium WebDriver, you can do with Nemo. But with Nightwatch, I'm not sure because I'm new at it, so I don't want to speak to that and say no or yes. But yeah.
That could be an extra bonus on Nemo's side compared to.
Thank you.
So, does Nemo use the same location that you use Selenium WebDriver?
So yeah, I mean, you can use the same locator strategies, and in the locator files that I have here, I just have the real shorthand of using CSS locators because those are the ones I'm most comfortable with as a web developer. But you can use any of the other locator strategies, and there's a more complicated format that you can use in the JSON to specify whether you're using XPath or what have you. So basically any WebDriver locator strategy you can use here.
Well, thanks, Matt.
Sure.